The Battle of Bataan is by far one of the darkest battles in American history. By the end of it, 10,000 Americans and Filipinos were killed, and over 76,000 Allied soldiers were captured, acting as the single largest surrender in United States history. But no one could have even imagined what these troops were about to be subjected to, and within roughly 10 days, most of them would be dead. We're going to break the whole battle down, showing exactly how the assumed inferior Japanese army got so much success, starting from the very beginning. But before we even get to the true horrors of Bataan where it all fell apart, you need to understand the one decision that sealed the fate of every single man who ended up there. See, the United States had a plan for exactly this situation. It was called War Plan Orange 3, and it had just been sitting there in a drawer since 1941. The plan was pretty straightforward. If Japan invaded, every single Allied soldier was supposed to fall back to the Bataan Peninsula and dig in, defending until the Navy could break through with reinforcements. More than 6 months of supplies should be left behind, pre-positioned on the peninsula, which was enough to keep 43,000 men alive and fighting until help arrived. It sounded like a solid plan at the time, and it genuinely was, but General Douglas MacArthur, who had been brought back to active duty in July 1941 to command all American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, arrived with an entirely different idea about how this war was going to go. He literally believed that his forces could stop a Japanese invasion at the beaches and hold the entire Philippine island chain, not just one peninsula. So instead of concentrating his men and pre-stocking Bataan, he spread 135,000 troops along hundreds of miles of coastline across multiple islands and told Washington he could hold them all. On November 27, 1941, Army Chief of Staff George Marshall sent MacArthur a direct warning that war with Japan was imminent. 10 days later, on December 8th, Japan hit Pearl Harbor and launched its assault on the Philippines almost simultaneously. When MacArthur got the call at 3:40 in the morning, his air commander, Major General Louis Brereton, was at headquarters within the hour asking for permission to launch a preemptive strike against Japanese air bases on Formosa, 500 miles to the north, before Japan could hit Clark Field. But MacArthur still refused to authorize it for nearly 7 hours, while Brereton kept asking. By the time MacArthur finally said yes, it was midday and the Japanese had already taken off. 35 American B-17 bombers, which was the entire strategic air force in the Philippines, were still sitting on the runway at Clark Field in neat rows when Japanese aircraft arrived overhead. Most of them were destroyed in under an hour, and with American air power gone and the Pacific Fleet completely shattered at Pearl Harbor, Japan's 14th Army, under General Masaharu Homma, arrived at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd. Over 43,000 soldiers landed in the north, while a second force hit the south. MacArthur's beach defenders could barely hold on, and on December 24th, he finally reversed course and ordered everyone to execute War Plan Orange 3. But most of the supplies that should have been waiting for them there were still stuck on the beaches, and that was over tens of thousands of tons of rice, ammunition, fuel, and medicine still sitting there in warehouses across Luzon. The US Army even burned over 250,000 gallons of fuel at Fort Stotzenburg alone, just to stop Japan from using it, and enormous caches of canned meat and flour were left behind, which the Japanese could simply take. But then something happened that truly turned the situation from dangerous to an absolute disaster. By January 6th, 1942, roughly 80,000 American and Filipino troops had made it onto the Bataan Peninsula, along with 26,000 Filipino civilians who had nowhere else to go. Wainwright's 1st Corps held the west side of the peninsula, and Parker's 2nd Corps held the east, with a mountain range running down the middle, making coordination between them nearly impossible. The retreat itself had been a near miracle. MacArthur had executed a double retrograde movement, two forces pulling back from opposite directions and funneling onto the peninsula ahead of Japanese spearheads trying to cut them off. Most men got through, but they arrived exhausted and with little food. MacArthur's headquarters even put everyone on half rations from day one. You see, the pre-war stockpile that had been intended for Bataan was meant to feed 43,000 men for 180 days. What they actually had by January 5th was roughly 50 days of canned meat, 30 days of flour, and almost no medicine at all, and that was now being split between nearly twice the planned number of people. Most soldiers were only surviving on around 2,000 calories a day while fighting in tropical heat and humidity, and a man doing hard labor in those conditions needs much closer to 4,000. Within weeks, the jungle was finishing the job Japan couldn't, and by February, malaria and dysentery had spread through the ranks, causing more men to be dying in the rear than the actual front where the gunfights occurred. The 26th Cavalry Regiment, one of the last horse cavalry units in the US Army, even ate their own horses due to the brutal supply shortages, and some soldiers begged, borrowed, and bartered their gear to Filipino villages for bananas and dried shrimp just to stay upright. Meanwhile, on the front, the fighting was fierce and the Americans were somehow doing better than anyone watching from the outside expected. On January 9th, the Japanese 65th Brigade launched the first major assault along the Abukai-Mauban line, the first defensive position across the peninsula. But these were far from the best Japanese troops. Homma's experienced 48th Infantry Division had been pulled from him and sent to the Dutch East Indies, just as the Bataan fight was starting. and in its place he received the 65th Brigade, 6,600 reservists recalled to duty who were poorly trained, aging men handed to him as a garrison force and told to take a fortified jungle peninsula. So American and Filipino 75mm artillery on the high ground tore straight into them, and 155mm howitzers, well concealed in the thick jungle growth, fired on Japanese positions the Japanese couldn't even locate from the air. The 65th Brigade took catastrophic losses and couldn't break through at all. By late January, Japan had pushed through the first line, but the Americans fell back in good order to a second defensive position, the Orion Bagak line, and stopped the Japanese dead in their tracks. Homer called a halt and sent word to Tokyo that he needed reinforcements and that the timetable was wrecked. See, Japan had planned to take Bataan in 50 days, but they were already well past that, and the peninsula was still holding. For the American men on the defensive side, this felt like proof that this battle might be winnable. Rumors started spreading that a relief convoy was coming and the Navy was on its way. Even MacArthur had sent messages telling his men to hold on, that help was coming, that their sacrifices would not be abandoned. But Washington had already decided in private that the Philippines was lost, and MacArthur, who had been telling his soldiers otherwise, was about to sneakily leave out the back door. And it was on March 11th, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur climbed into a PT boat at Corregidor Island with his wife, his 4-year-old son, and 17 members of his staff and slipped away into the dark. Roosevelt had ordered him to Australia to take command of Allied forces in the Pacific. When the men on Bataan woke up the next morning and found out their commanding general was gone, some understood it was a direct presidential order, but most of them were less generous. There are stories told by soldiers on Bataan that MacArthur had visited the peninsula exactly once during the entire campaign, spending most of his time in the tunnel fortress on Corregidor Island. The nickname that spread through the foxholes within days of his departure was Dugout Doug. Soldiers wrote and sang a parody to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. One verse even went, "Dugout Doug's not timid, he's just cautious, not afraid. He's protecting carefully the stars that Franklin made." When MacArthur landed in Australia and told reporters, "I came through and I shall return," the men still in the jungle read that line and felt like a boot to the face. Command passed to General Jonathan Wainwright, and he knew he had been thrown to the wolves. At this point, he had no air cover because the last American planes in the Philippines had been destroyed or evacuated weeks before, and no naval support because the Asiatic fleet had pulled out in December. No one was coming to save them. What he did have, though, was roughly 80,000 sick, starving men spread across a jungle peninsula, and one simple order: hold the line by any means necessary. By March, the 2 field hospitals on Bataan were holding 10,000 patients between them. The other half of the remaining force could barely qualify as combat effective, which by that point simply meant a man who could walk 100 yards without collapsing and still raise his weapon at the end of it. Most soldiers had shed over 30% of their body weight. They called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. Meanwhile, Homer had spent February and early March doing what MacArthur had been trying to do since December, stocking his position properly. Waves of fresh infantry divisions arrived from Japan, and numerous heavy artillery pieces were brought forward and ranged on the Orion Bagak line, ready to finish off the last American defenses. At the same time, Japanese air power returned to the skies over the peninsula, and for men in foxholes with no anti-aircraft guns worth the name, that meant the strikes came in unopposed. On April 3rd, 1942, the Japanese began their final offensive with more than 100 aircraft hitting the American positions first. Then the artillery started, one of the heaviest preparatory barrages of the entire Pacific War, crashing into defensive positions that were manned by men who hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 months. And as you probably expect, the line broke within only a few hours. Units that had held through 99 days of fighting dissolved in an afternoon because the Americans left behind simply had nothing more to give, and the man who had to decide what came next was not MacArthur. It was a general named Edward King, and the decision he was about to make would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the morning of April 9, 1942, Major General Edward King drove forward through the wreckage of a collapsing front and asked for a meeting with the Japanese command. He was going to surrender, and he did it against direct orders not to. Wainwright, operating from Corregidor, had been told by MacArthur that no surrender was authorized, and Wainwright had passed that order down. King looked at what he had left and made his own call according to the situation. Before he went, he gathered his senior officers and told them clearly, "You did not surrender, you obeyed my order, and the responsibility is mine alone." He was later driven to the Balanga Elementary School for a meeting with Japanese Colonel Motu Nakayama. King asked whether his men would be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, but Nakayama did not answer the question, and no surrender document was signed. King simply handed over his pistol, and that was that. The voice of freedom broadcast from Corregidor went out across the Philippines that afternoon with a single sentence: Bataan has fallen. But then came the next issue. Japan had expected maybe 40,000 prisoners. What they found when the shooting stopped was closer to 78,000, and almost every single one of them was already severely weakened. Japan's logistics were built for a fast campaign, not for processing the largest prisoner intake in the history of the Pacific War. And layered on top of the logistical chaos was something worse: the attitude of the Japanese military toward men who surrendered. In Japanese military culture, surrender was not a pragmatic decision made under impossible odds. It was a moral failure, a permanent disgrace, and something that stripped a man of any claim to decent treatment. In their eyes, the newly gained American prisoners were not prisoners of war. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a senior staff officer who had already gained a reputation for advocating the execution of prisoners in China, did not wait for orders. He issued his own instructions, unauthorized and against General Homer's stated policy, to execute American prisoners. And the first mass killing happened within hours of the surrender going into effect. At the Pantingan River, roughly 350 to 400 Filipino officers and NCOs were marched to the riverbank and shot. And what came next would become some of the darkest few weeks of American history. It would turn out to be a deliberate, days-long killing of men who could no longer defend themselves. On April 10th, 1942, Japanese guards began assembling prisoners into columns of roughly 100 men and pointing them north up the East Road. No one told them how far they were going, but the destination was Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training ground near the town of Capas, over 65 miles away. Lieutenant Kermit Lay recalled that they were pulled into a rice field, ordered to empty their pockets, and laid everything out in front of them in the heat, while guards moved through the group, slapping men, taking rings, and pulling out anything valuable. And when a man near Lay had Japanese souvenirs on him, coins, and a couple of items picked up after a firefight, the Japanese were enraged. So multiple guards took him behind a rice shed and shot him. Word went through the columns instantly: get rid of anything Japanese, anything that could be mistaken for loot, or you would die. And then the long march began. The walk lasted 5 to 10 days depending on where a prisoner joined it, and for the entire length of it, guards allowed almost no water stops, and men who stepped out of column to reach for liquid from a roadside puddle, even fouled brown water in a carabao wallow, were shot instantly. Colonel Ernest Miller, who survived the march and wrote a detailed account afterward, described men reaching a state approaching insanity from thirst, scooping stagnant water from road ditches because they could not stop themselves, knowing it was contaminated with dysentery, drinking it anyway. Men who slowed down were beaten with rifle butts, saber handles, bamboo clubs, and anything a guard had in hand. Corporal James Bollock, who gave an account decades later, said, "They beat us with rifle butts, sabers, clubs, anything they could get their hands on. That went on all day long. Once anybody collapsed, the Japanese immediately killed them. It looked like they were really trying to kill us all." Filipino civilians who tried to pass food or water through the column were beaten and in many cases executed on the road in front of the prisoners. As a message, the sun treatment, as survivors called it, was used on groups pulled out of columns and forced to kneel in the open with no shade in full tropical sun for hours at a time, until men passed out or died from the exposure. Those who could not rise were buried alive, beaten to death with entrenching tools, or left in the road for the supply trucks that followed the columns and simply drove over anything still on the tarmac. American spy Claire Phillips, recovering from malaria while in hiding near the route, watched the columns through binoculars and later wrote that she saw guards running bayonets through men who dropped and kicking the bodies off the road. Her account matches what dozens of survivors described independently.
Japanese told me to smile, I did. They told me to sit, I sat. They told me to march, I marched. They hit me, it was okay. They broke my nose, knocked my teeth out, they split my head open, but I still had to go to reach those herd of caribou. Then when I got to the herd of caribou, then I'd find another goal, and another goal, and another goal.
After roughly 55 miles on foot, the survivors reached the rail junction at San Fernando, where Japanese guards crammed them into tiny steel boxcars built to hold 40 men, and in each one, they packed 100 inside. The cars were sealed with no ventilation and sat in the tropical heat for hours before moving. Some men died standing upright, held in place by the pressure of other bodies, and the living couldn't even move away from them. And from Capas Station, survivors walked a final 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell. Around 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans died on the march itself, but the march was just the start of the dying. At Camp O'Donnell, the Japanese commandant told the incoming prisoners on arrival that they were not prisoners of war, they were captives of the Imperial Japanese Army, and that he considered them lower than criminals. The camp had one water faucet for 9,000 American prisoners. Lines to reach it stretched back hundreds of yards, and men waited for hours in the heat to get to it, and many died before they reached the front. There was almost no food and almost no medicine. Around 400 men, Filipinos and Americans, were dying every single day. Starting in 1942, Japan began shipping American prisoners from the Philippines to forced labor camps in Japan, China, and Korea on unmarked cargo vessels with no ventilation below decks, no sanitation, and almost no food or water for crossings that took days. The Arisen Maru, carrying 1,800 American prisoners in October 1944, was torpedoed by an American submarine that had no way of knowing what it was carrying. General Homer was tried for war crimes after the war and executed in 1946. Colonel Tsuji, the man who ordered the Pantingan River massacre and issued the unofficial kill orders that shaped what the march became, was never charged. He spent the post-war years writing memoirs, 2 of which became bestsellers in Japan, and in 1952 he won a seat in the Japanese parliament. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing.